Hello and welcome to our podcast at Get Legally Speaking. Our legal conversation today will be about employment law during the COVID-19 crisis. I'm here today remotely recording with Barrister James Tunley from Lamb Chambers in London. James is a specialist employment barrister and he advises and represents both claimants and defendants respondents at all stages of the court and the tribunal process, with particular strengths in employers' liability, discrimination and unfair dismissal, to name but a few. James has delivered lectures and training on both employment claims in the County Court and on the National Minimum Wage Act 1998. Thank you very much for joining us, James.
My pleasure.
So this is a very current topic, and I was just saying that before we press the record button on our Zoom application here. You know, lots and lots of people during this pandemic, during this worldwide crisis, and particularly, you know, lots of people also in the UK, very, very worried and concerned about their employment, about their income. And we've been inundated with questions of, you know, what we can discuss during this podcast. So we will get through as many as we can. So the first question that we're going to try and discuss, James, is what is the coronavirus job retention scheme? What does that mean, please?
Okay, so this scheme was the scheme that was introduced by the Chancellor on the 20th of March. And it's a temporary scheme that's going to be open for at least 3 months, although I expect the government will no doubt extend that if needed. And it's there to help employers meet their costs of the wages. And it's a scheme that's backdated to the 1st of March. And it allows employers to claim from the government 80% of the wages of each employer up to £2,500 per month per employee.
Of the salary. So if you were, for example, earning £3,000, then 80% of that could be claimed by your employer, but a maximum of £2,500.
That's right. And then in addition to that, so outside of the cap, the employer can also claim for the national insurance contributions and the pension contributions for the auto enrolment pension scheme, so the minimum pension contributions that they're going to make.
Right. And then it's also an important point of that, because I've read recently about the gap, where there's a gap in the scheme, because it says that you would have had to be on the PAYE as of the 28th, on or before the 28th of February 2020. So there's individuals who have started employment in a new job after the 28th of February, and they are sort of a little bit high and dry at the moment, because the government hasn't actually announced, I don't think, what happens to those people.
No, that's right. There are always going to be gaps in these schemes, and that's exactly the case. You have to have been on the payroll as at the 28th of February, so the day before the scheme start date. So yes, those people aren't able to, their employers aren't able to take advantage of this scheme, unfortunately.
But I mean, the government may announce something for those employees, because there is a significant number of people who are concerned in that way. In terms of when we think this scheme is going to be, I mean, they're saying you can backdate it to the 1st of March, but I don't think there's been any announcements as of yet how to make the application, how the employer can make the application, where to go to make the application. I think the government's still working on that, aren't they?
They are. They haven't announced anything concrete as yet. It's expected, I think I read somewhere, that there's going to be an online portal that employers can apply online. And that's expected to open at the end of this month, end of April. Don't know much more than that.
Yes.
Luckily, though, because it's run off the PAYE scheme, HMRC, or whichever government department is taking responsibility for this, is going to have a lot of information already, but it is down to the employer to make that application to the government.
Yes, no, indeed. Okay, so question number 2, can any employer furlough its workers? And let's explain what we mean by the term furlough.
Okay, so we'll start with that. Furlough in this context means placing your employees on a period of leave due to the particular circumstances. So essentially you say to your employees, you're on leave, stay at home, you don't need to do any work. So that's what the process is, and it's linked with the job retention scheme, in that in order to claim this 80% of the wages, the employer has to furlough its workers, so put them on leave.
So can I just ask, if you're put on furlough, which is the temporary leave by
Yes.
a company, and and the terms say that it has to be due to economic conditions that that a specific employer is going through, or the economy as a whole, is the employer obligated to pay its staff during that time, or does that depend on the structure of the business, the size of the business, etc.?
So it depends on the terms of the employment contract. Some contracts, although I expect there's probably going to be a minority, may already have a provision in there that says your employer can put you on unpaid leave in particular circumstances.
So it's
if they
worth reading
don't,
the contract to see whether there is that clause in there that if they can put you on furlough or unpaid leave with no pay.
yeah, but the idea behind this, in order for the employer to get the 80% back from the government, is that they've got to pay you at least 80% of your wages. So
And
you're
that's
not, in realistic terms, you're not going to be put on unpaid leave. You're going to receive at least 80%, but you're still entitled to what you're entitled to under your contract. That may be your full pay, in which case the employer can make up the other 20%, or you can reach an agreement with your employer that you'll accept a 20% reduction in your pay.
Okay, so that's a very, very crucial point then, because what we're saying is, if your employer puts you on furlough, which I suspect a lot of people are currently on, given that the lockdown situation that we're in as a country, they have to continue paying you up to 80% of your salary in order to then make the claim to the government to claim back that 80% to assist them as a business to continue to pay you. That's unless we're saying your contract stipulates there's a very specific point in your contract that says that you can be put on leave with no pay. But having said that, I suspect those contracts and those employers, if they're not paying their staff under those conditions, I suspect they're going to struggle to go to the government and say, well, I want the help, I want the assistance through the job retention scheme.
Yeah, they simply won't be able to. You've got to pass that 80% on to your employees. And I think the other point you asked was that, well, can any employer do this?
Yes.
Yes, they can, large or small, in any sector of industry. There are 2 points, though, that I would point out. The first one is that the period of furlough, so that period of leave, has got to be at least 3 weeks. And as I said, the employer needs your agreement before they can furlough you, and either that will be in your contract or your collective agreement, whatever holds your terms and conditions, or they'll need to get your express agreement before doing that.
Right. So yes, I mean that's interesting. That's really interesting, because people are saying, is this legal? Yes, the government has said shut down only. Actually, the guidelines are only attend at your job if you cannot do it from home.
Yes.
However, we are seeing a lot of businesses, obviously, high streets are closed, factories are closed, lots of places are closed, and those people can't do it from home, but they can't work in a retail store from home. So yes, I think that we've gone beyond the basic guidelines. We don't know today, and today's the 2nd of April 2020. We don't know if after today the government might say total lockdown, but it's interesting that the retailers have chosen to close down, because, as I said, the guidelines that I saw for the lockdown was stay at home, but only go to work if you can't do your job from home. and I'm obviously speaking outside of the police and the NHS and other support services that we have. Okay, so question number 3: am I protected from being dismissed or made redundant by my employer during or at the end of the furlough period?
In short, the answer is no. There's no additional protection just because you're under the furlough scheme. So your employer can, if circumstances dictate, they can decide to make you redundant.
During or after, would you say, James?
Either or. They can. It's a business decision for them. If the point comes during the furlough period that
They just
the
can't
decision
survive
is
as a business
taken, if
anymore.
they shut down or they reduce the number of staff, and that's something they have to do to survive, and they've got to make that decision. They've still obviously got to go through the proper and fair process if they're doing that, but there's nothing to stop them from making you redundant either during or at the end of it.
Very
But
worrying times.
this scheme is designed to stop that, obviously, but it's not going to save everyone, I don't think.
No, and I mean, let's just, you've got to be realistic here. The expenses of a business is not just its staff.
No, absolutely.
You've got your rent, you've got your rates, possibly. You've got if you've got debt, that has to be managed, and it just depends. I mean, I sit there and I think, well, think about the food retailers. So they've got these fridges full of all this food, all this stock, and most retailers have, they back order, so it's a regular delivery of certain stuff that they've probably paid for or in the process of, and all of that is just going to be zeroed out. It's going to be a loss. The loss is that, even the fashion industry, I was thinking about the fashion industry and I was thinking, well, they've actually, stocked up on certain items to service this time of the year. And if we're all locked up for the next 3 months, what do they do with that stock? That, and then what's happening to the new stock that's coming and things like that. So yes, I think that we have to be mindful that most employers, I'd say, don't just have the staff element of cost as a direct cost to the business, as an expenditure. I know that the government's announced assistance to businesses by way of grants and loans, but again, what I'm hearing at the moment is that nobody knows when it's going to start, when they can access it, how it can be accessed, and it just may be too late for a lot of retailers. We've already heard some big names, in the airline industry. I think yesterday Virgin saying, look, if we don't get government assistance, we're about to go. In the high street, we've heard of names that are just not surviving this period. So what chance does the smaller man have? The smaller, medium-sized businesses who don't have perhaps the support of the banks in the sense of just turning up and saying, well, just extend that overdraft or just throw some money at us to sustain us at this time. It's very, very challenging times, I have to say. So the next question is, this, I mean, of course, the answers to these questions can change as the government lends more support, is what happens if I have already been made redundant after the lockdown was announced? Can I get financial support from the government? What are we saying on that at the moment, James?
It depends when you were made redundant. If you were made redundant after the 28th of February, then your previous employer, can essentially rehire you and put you on the furlough worker scheme, in which case you'll get 80% of your pay. Because
that's very interesting. So what we're saying is, before the job retention scheme was announced,
yes,
you were made redundant after the 28th of February because businesses were slowly started to lock down, your employer can say to you today, I'll employ you so that I can claim that 80%, and then obviously you will get, as an employee, that 80%.
Yes, that's right. So you've got that. So the scheme was announced on the 20th of March, backdated to the 1st of March. So you've got, a 3-week period where businesses were looking at what was coming down the line and the situation as it was then. Obviously, it's getting worse as we speak. But a lot of decisions would have been made within that period. Some people would have been made redundant because the business simply couldn't carry on. There was no idea what support would be forthcoming from the government.
Yes.
Now that's been announced, you can sort of go back to where you were at the 28th of February and then take back those employees that you had to let go.
Yes, well, that's very interesting. And obviously the government has announced the benefit schemes that are open to people to apply if you are in serious difficulty. And I think the government's own website at gov.uk can give some information on that. They're saying, look, even though if you're employed, if you're then made redundant or you've been told no money right now, sorry, no wages, there are some benefit schemes that can assist, and I would urge people who are in difficult positions to take a look at that. So the next question is, I'm on a 0 hours contract and my hours and pay vary. How will my pay be calculated if I am furloughed? Can 0 hours contracts employees be furloughed?
Yes, they can. It can apply to any type of contract, any worker. The way that the pay is calculated, it's your normal salary before tax, excluding things like commission and bonuses. And so if you're 0 hours, your pay may vary. It may be seasonal, for example. You get more pay in December around Christmas time, or in the summer months, for example, when it might be particularly busy. So there are two ways that the government has said you can do this. Either you look at the same period for the year before. So, for example, April 2019, that would be your wage for April 2020, and then you can work out 80% of that. Or you can look at what the average earnings were over the last 12 months and work it out that way. And the good thing for employees is that the figure that you take, looking at those two methods, you take the highest amount.
Okay.
So whichever calculation comes out higher.
That seems a first, to take the highest amount.
Yeah,
Yes,
so it's not all bad news.
Yes.
So yes, you take the highest amount, and that maybe that second one of taking your average over 12 months, that may benefit 0 hours workers more, as I say, because their work could be seasonal and vary throughout the year.
Yes. No, that's I think that's going to be music to many people's ears. And I think that provided employers try to keep on top and keep themselves informed about this assistance, in several ways that the government's trying to assist, then that benefit can move on to people. It's a matter of people keeping on top of what's being said and where. Right. Well, we've got time literally for maybe 2 questions. Let's try and do another 2, because I'm really interested in the questions, and we haven't even touched on directors and things like that, but that's a separate podcast. Right. My employer is still open for business, but I'm worried about contracting the coronavirus if I go into my workplace. Can my employer insist that I work, or can I insist that I stay in self-isolation, even if I'm well, and take my pay? Hope to take my pay.
This is really tough, and hopefully employers are going to listen to concerns and just take a reasonable approach. But the answer is yes, they can insist that you attend work. If you don't have a valid reason to be absent, then they may have disciplinary, or they probably will have disciplinary policies for those eventualities.
And I'm talking about probably the supermarkets here, James, because I'm seeing, obviously, we try to attend as least as we can, but there's staff serving us, and because they're open for business for obvious reasons. And I do think, what's happening to people who say, I'm worried. The whole public, everybody out there is coming in, okay, in lesser numbers. There's the queuing going on outside, and the courtesy of making sure one person comes out and another person is let in, so that we try and keep as distant as we can from people. But what happens if you say, well, I'm sorry, I'm worried I can catch this deadly virus, I don't want to come into work for that reason, I think it's going to get pretty complicated in law if an employer says, well, if you don't, I'll sack you. Do you not think that will get complicated at some point?
Yeah, absolutely. And if they take that approach, then and they threaten to sack you, I mean, obviously you're going to have protection for unfair dismissal, and that will come down to a question of whether the employer is acting as a reasonable employer and taking a decision that's fair and reasonable.
And it's going to be tough for them to prove that they were being fair and reasonable by saying to somebody, well, we all know there's a deadly disease out there, and yes, I'll give you some gloves, and yes, I might even give you a mask, although we've been told that masks alone don't protect because your eyes and your ears and your face and everything is exposed, unless they put people in sort of these hazmat suits, which I haven't seen anybody in those. I think I saw a picture of Naomi Campbell at the airport 10 days, a week or so ago in one of those travelling. But, it's going to be tough for them to persuade a court or the employment tribunal that they were being fair as an employer by saying, tough, you come in, you work under these conditions, or you're being made fired. You're getting fired.
It will be an incredibly brave employer who takes that step.
Yeah.
Have those conversations with your employer. There are various health and safety regulations and obligations that the employer has to follow to make sure you're safe in your workplace. So see what measures they can put in place. And if you're in that vulnerable category of having a long-term health condition, being pregnant, or you're over 70, then there are additional protections under the Equality Act that you're likely to qualify
for. Or if you've got underlying health conditions, but you're still able to work. I mean, there's lots of people who perhaps have underlying health conditions. They go into the high risk category. The government 3 weeks ago said, you need to be isolating now, anybody with underlying health conditions, or if you're over 70, and therefore you can't go into your employer, but your employer says, well, come in, or you have to go because I have to replace you with somebody that can do the job. Well, James, that has been incredibly informative. Thank you so much for your time.
You're very welcome.
I think we should do a part 2 next week, if I may say so myself, because there's lots of questions still that we are yet to get answered, and I think there'll be even more.
I will happily return.
Fantastic. So what I will say to our listeners is don't forget to click and subscribe to our podcasts, and you can find us on Twitter, Facebook and LinkedIn by searching Get Legally Speaking. Also visit our website at getlegallyspeaking.com. Thank you for listening.